So by complete coincidence, Stain, we have the birthday of Saxo, middle of September 1992. Interestingly, the day before so-called Black Wednesday, the day when sterling was kicked out of the ERM, European Exchange Rate Mechanism. You were a trader, an FX trader, apropos that at the time. Take us a little bit through. You can talk a little bit, of course, about the day itself, but also the nature of trading back then. I mean, we're also familiar with clicking buttons on a screen now. But the nature of trading FX, and specifically trading FX during a crazy historical event like that.
Well, I think everyone has seen the movie Wall Street, and of course it's a bit of a sort of stage scenery with all the people shouting and screaming. But in August, September, October of 1992, that was the reality. It was simply crazy. As soon as someone was asking for a price in $100 million mark, another guy was asking for 300, another for 200. Because of course, as the event was unfolding, there was a huge amount of volatility going on and uncertainty. And at the time, you didn't know what to do. And specifically, of course, the sterling attack, which was central to this, created a huge amount of dissonance with the market. I remember one morning coming in and Swedish interest rates overnight was 10,000%. 10,000%. I mean, even though it's only for one day, just backtrack that to what it was overnight. So there was no liquidity. Whoever owned some position was in the driver's seat. So it was erratic. It was crazy. I was a proprietary trader. We were trying to gauge when and how long would the Bank of England stay afloat, how much money could they afford. And at the same time, I was, as Saxo was born, I was sitting at what is now JP Morgan on their trading floor. And we had clients, I remember, you probably remember the name, but Bank Negara, which was the central bank of Malaysia, was the single biggest operator in the foreign exchange market. The car companies in Europe was massive foreign exchange speculators. All of them just sold sterling every single day, every single minute. I mean, we are talking billions, and sterling was up and down, sideways, and everything else. But apart from that, it was also, of course, going into other currencies. At the time, we had DRM systems, so market scooters, Mark Spain, Mark Greek, and all this stuff. Mark Austria, even Austria had its currency at the time.
So say Mark, you're talking about the German mark, Mark.
Yeah, the Deutsche Mark at the time, which is now sort of replaced by the euro. But it was, I wouldn't say fun is probably wrong because a lot of people lost a lot of money, but it was crazy. It really was like the Wall Street movies.
And I guess back then, most of the market players, market operators, you mentioned car companies, central banks, these are large players, a very heated environment. Obviously, you could do large amounts, but probably at not the tightest spreads compared to what we're used to today. So you've seen that sort of democratization of access via the internet. What would you say is really different from your perspective, somebody that was in that sort of heat of the moment, phone brokering and phone trading, as it transitioned into the internet era?
No, I think Saxo is a great representative for the evolution that's been going on in the market because, at the time it was brokers, voice brokers. So the only noise that you heard constantly from 6 o'clock in the morning till you went home was 60-65, 60-65, paid, and then a new price. And so it was voice brokers who made a fortune by intermediating the flow. But actually, when I joined Saxo, which was in 2000, we were part of a pilot program with Deutsche Bank. I think Kim will say, and it is true, that we wrote the first API, the technology solution that you use. So, but I remember being head of trading at Saxo at the time that we made a bet with Deutsche Bank's representative that if we could surpass $200 million a day, he would give champagne to the whole company. Mind you, the company back then wasn't the 2,500 people we have today, but rather 60, 70, 80 people. But getting to that point doing electronic trading, and listen to this, John. Number one, the computer screens was this thick, and the way we had prices delivered to us was a URL address with Deutsche Bank, and then you had to renew. So you were asking for euro dollars in 10 and then you had to wait for the response from
10 million.
10 million, and then you were asking, waiting for the screen to come back. And if you were lucky and fast enough due to the internet connectivity and hit the price, but most of the time it failed, and then you had to do it again and again. So initially it was this trial and error process. But as we wrote the API, you move to a more free-floating currency term. So we are coming from 92 voice brokers. The brokers of the world are the dominant players. The biggest banks in the world were Citibank, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, all competing for the same institutional business. And then this democratization that we talk about at large in Saxo began, and it really accelerated from 2008 to 2005, which of course coincides with our company being able to be part not only of the journey, but also part of the solution to this.
Yeah, and then liquidity being such a key factor, but also these big historic events like we just talked about with the Bank of England crisis in 1992. We've had a number of other crazy crises. We've had the Swiss National Bank removing the ceiling on the Swiss franc. We had the rise of a whole new currency in the euro that really kicked into gear after it was started in 1999, but especially in 2002. That's when I was cutting my teeth on foreign exchange, and there was all the talk of reserve rebalancing. So the dollar was the global reserve currency, and now it's going to be at least some of it diversified into euros. And there was a couple of 3 years there where the euro just could only seem to go up in wave fashion from month to month. It seems like the number one recurring question since then is always this: the dollar is reserve currency, and what's going to replace it? And I never know what to answer, because there is no other national currency. It never has been good to have a single national currency as the global reserve currency. It's just become that way because you have to have a currency as the global reserve standard. How do you answer that question when you're asked that? Because I'm sure you've been asked it a million times as well.
I think it's going to be extremely difficult to unseat the dollar as the number one currency. I think in cross-border trades today, still over 90% of the total flow. And then the renminbi and sterling and Swiss and others, euro, is trying to make a stand. But it's very difficult because from a mathematical or practical perspective, US runs a huge current account deficit. When you run a current account deficit, it means that your saving is smaller than your consumption. So you're actually exporting your deficit to the rest of the world, which is Denmark and Turkey and England and other guys are buying. So by virtue, to be a global currency, ironically, you need to be in a position where you export capital at all times. So you're making your currency available to the rest. Okay, take Europe, which was the natural sort of in line replacement for the dollar. It can't do that because Europe until now has run a current account surplus. Right. So the amount of free-floating euros that goes into the rest of the world is very, very small. The second structure you need to look at is the size of the different capital markets. So the US fixed income and equity market is about 10 times bigger than the second biggest one. And we can use that analogy for Denmark or for the Netherlands. We are two countries that are very rich and have a very high pension saving. So in Denmark, the pension saving is saved gross, so you don't pay tax before you actually take the money out, which means that it accumulates at a very high nominal rate. So the Danish savings system has 400% of the Danish GDP in savings. So imagine all that money was supposed to be put into the Danish market. It's impossible simply because you are 4 times what is the total size of the economy, not even just the one that is on the stock exchange, but full size. So what the Danish pension system needs to do is to go overseas into euro-denominated assets and in particular US-denominated assets. So that's the second sort of boundary for it. And then third is that despite what we think of the US at any given time, it's still the system that people admire the most in terms of its ability to survive and sustain itself. And that's in a world where we are today, 30 years later than Saxo's birth. It's very much about self-sufficiency and energy scarcity or energy excess in the case of US. And you can say whatever you want of US, but they have all the resources inside their own borders. They could actually, if any nation in the world could, they could probably live on their own. So, from those 3 principles, I think it's very difficult to see that the dollar is going to diminish in its rate.
But there are others out there as well. Japan, South Korea. These are big economies that have keep your exports cheap, accumulate dollars. Are we at the end of the road for this model, and what does it mean, this whole deglobalization process? In FX terms, especially.
If FX term, but overall, I think we are at the sunset of the Western world. The Western world have.
Is that all?
No, but not necessarily negative. But what is going on is that the Western world have overextended its stay in terms of using a high proportion of the total energy generation in the world, which we see as an energy crisis now because the rest of the world wants to take back or use it for themselves. And they have been in a position where from the commercial agenda has been able to put down thresholds and counterbalances to when a country became too strong. I think that is the sunset we see with civilization. I think Peter Garner said it really well recently that we are short of a common denominator in politics and in social policies globally. This concept that the Western world believe in democracies doesn't really matter because there are more countries in the world that are non-democracies than democracies, number one. And number two, the democratic model is not exactly a stellar example of what you should do in order to get to productivity and a happier and ever prosperous society. So I think that is under attack. But in terms of the currency, it's pretty clear to me that this fragmentation means that we're going to split the world into different zones. We'll have a Western world as we know it. And then the eastern side will be driven by a Chinese agenda. China is, sometimes doing own goals. So is Europe doing own goals on itself in this ability to navigate. I think the pipe dream is that Europe can sustain and rise to the occasion to become a third zone of currency might. But right now it looks like we're going to have two dominant zones, a renminbi-driven market where export-import is driven up against the currency, basket trading essentially as you and I will know it, and then the Western world remains with the dollar system. But I think the lessons in China from Ukraine and Russia's being taken off the SWIFT system, the payment system, and the ability of using and weaponizing dollar, I think it's something that at least the long-term planners in China and around Asia is taking note of, and even in Southern America, which again is a resource-rich thing. So we're getting to the point where what the world needs sits outside Europe and the Western world to a large extent, and in order to create a common prosperous future, we need to engage in multilateralism. But what we are doing, of course, is we're doing bilateral and more fragmented policies across the board, including what is coined as strategic resourcing, as strategic planning, more military spending, and the others. So we are moving from a world that is interacting and continue to exceed the expectation in terms of trade flows to one where we are diminishing the common denominator, which is trade and exchange of ideas.
And now that we have quite large interest rate increases as well, people need to remember that there's something called carry. Yeah. So tell people, if they don't know, familiar with the concept of carry and why it's so important when you're looking at exchange rates and especially your returns over time.
Yeah, so the theory dictates that the risk you are paid to have a currency exposure is inflation plus a risk premium. Mm. What tends to happen theoretically is that the risk premium is too high relatively. So at any given time, people like now, Turkey has been very weak. Everybody knows that Turkey is in a huge amount of trouble. But for a foreign exchange guy, that is really relatively relevant. If you're paid 100% a year to be long Turkish lira, it effectively means that if you're long for 1 year, you get all your money back, right? So the relative price that you're getting paid relative to the risk is what you monitor. And generally in foreign exchange and in interest rate arbitrage in foreign exchange, where you buy the high interest rate and sell the cheap interest rate, the market wants to be overcompensated for the risk of the difference. Mm. So a classic one would be Swiss franc versus Brazilian real. And they go, the strongest country in the world versus a country that continues to fight for its existence and political future. But if the spread between these two is large enough to compensate for the risk, which it very often will be, then this becomes one of the most beautiful games in the industry, simply because you are arbitraging the total amount of risk seen by the market relative to the absolute risk. And in general terms, not only in foreign exchange, but in the market, the reason why geopolitical risk, the war in Ukraine and breakdowns, Russia's default and other things, doesn't translate is that the market overcompensate in terms of the risk premium once, and then risk agents steps in and take that. And foreign exchange players are generally very good at taking this risk off and arbitrage it. So I think the evolution from phone brokerage, which we talk about, all the way through to where we are today, the democratization of the market. I think Saxo's platform is without a doubt the best macro traders background platform you can have in the world. But what I think Saxo excels and what will distinguish the market for the next 10 years is personal service. Is that if you can combine best in breed online with a personal service, which of course is at least what we're trying to achieve at Saxo, I think that's a winning combination. I think if you look at the underforest of new businesses growing up, it's niche, it's franchise, it's personal. So I think we went too far with the platform economy and the overall strategy of scale for the sake of scale. I think you need scale. That is absolutely obvious for all the reasons that is embedded into that. But I think to make a big distinction between the platforms that are similar in color and feel, you need to find the personal touch. I think to some extent, although it's 30 years ago that I sat on a trading floor with voice brokers, I think the future voice broker is the guy who calls his clients, make sure he's okay, and have 4 or 5 meeting points with that client over a space of a year. I don't think we ever go away from the personal interaction in what we do. It needs to be scalable and delivered in the right way. But I think that is really with the strengths of the future. So I'm very optimistic because I think we depersonalized it when we were democratizing. I think we are repersonalizing it through what's going on with tailor-made products on the scale side and on the personal touch on the personal side. So I'm very optimistic about both trading and platforms and the ability to embrace both technology but also the classy personal agenda that sits with that.